let's talk about magic loop. So magic loop uses 2 needles instead of 3 or 4 needles, like double pointed needles, like you would with double pointed needles. So the benefit of this, well, there are a couple benefits of this. So for me personally, I find having multiple needles, or more than 2 needles rather, just fiddly and awkward, and I'm always afraid that I'm going to lose stitches off the back ends of them. And having the extra needles just gets in the way of how I hold my yarn and tension my yarn while I'm knitting. So that's probably the primary reason, or the 2 primary reasons, why I prefer magic loop over double pointed needles. The other factor is, and maybe it kind of can be combined with the fiddly part, but working with 2 needles is what we're used to doing. When we learn to knit a scarf, a hat, a shawl, we're mainly working on just 2 needles, with the exception of maybe a hat once you start the decreases for the crown. But I mean, again, for me personally, I always use magic loop for that. Now that I know magic loop, but when I first started knitting, I used double pointed needles for crown decreases. But I find the 2 needles just far more familiar and just easier. So I want to teach you how my tips and tricks of how to implement the magic loop technique. So I've gone ahead, we are going to cast on, and we're going to do our ribbing in the upcoming tutorials, but I wanted to take a moment now that I have a little bit of knitting on my needles so that I can show you more clearly how I tension my yarn and how to make this work. So the Alsie Socks pattern is specifically written for working on 2 needles in the magic loop technique, with the magic loop technique. If you prefer using 2 separate cabled needles, so maybe you have 2 maybe 32-inch needles, you could use 2 sets of needles, very much in the same way that I'm going to show you, using just one set of needles on one long 40-inch cable. This is a 40-inch long cable, and I really do prefer the more flexible cords for magic loop. They don't kink. This is Chiaogu bamboos. You could use any of the long cables that have a really flexible cord. I think that's key when learning magic loop. I find I have a set of Turbo Addy needles from ages ago when I used to really love those needles, and I don't find their cords to be quite as flexible. I made it work because that's what I was working on when I first learned magic loop. But really, if you're going out to buy needles, just please make sure that you check how flexible the cable is, because that may just make or break your experience with magic loop. Okay, so like I said, I've already cast it on and I've done a little ribbing. I have tutorials for those, but I want to stop right now so that I can really give you a clear demonstration on how to knit in magic loop. Okay, so the first thing to keep in mind is that we're still knitting in a circle. Okay, we're knitting in a round, right? So when you start your round, or start at the beginning of a needle, so needle 1, needle 2, this is needle 2, the stitches that are on needle 2, you always want to have your yarn as if you're going to be working this first stitch. So make sure, So make sure, just as if our work was on very small, round, circular needles, that this working yarn is right behind, if you're going to knit this stitch, right behind that first needle. If you do this, or if you do this, you will have a yarn over in between the stitches on needle 1 and needle 2. That in sock knitting is not the end of the world, because when you come back around and knit this next round, you almost certainly will notice, hey, there's a loop on my needle that shouldn't be there. Just slide it off. It's not, you're not dropping the stitch, you're just dropping that yarn over. And because socks are designed to be so very stretchy, it's just going to, as you start wearing your socks, it's going to stretch out and you're not even going to notice that extra loop. Even now, sometimes that happens to me, and I have been doing this. I've been doing this technique for so many years now. It surprises me. I'm like, oh gosh, I must have not had my yarn in the right place at the beginning of that round. So okay, so that is my tip number 1. Make sure that you have your yarn positioned correctly. So I'm going to slide my needle 2 out, and see how the back half of the stitches, the second half of the stitches, are just sitting on the cable. You can imagine this cable as being an additional double pointed needle. Okay, so if you were working with 3 double pointed needles, you would have your stitches, your half of your stitches on one double pointed needle, half of your stitches on another double pointed needle, and then you would have your working needle. So the cable is just acting as if it's acting in place of that extra needle. Okay, so the other really critical thing to understand is you are moving from this stitch that looks like it's in the back to this stitch, and we're kind of stretching this out a little bit. So you want to make sure that your first couple stitches are pretty snug. And let me zoom out for a second so I can show you. I like to hold my cable down out of the way. So I kind of hold it with my my 3 extra fingers down with the needle when I first get started. Okay, so I'm holding that cable out of the way so it's not up here and I'm like trying to fight around it and stuff. Okay, so I hold that down. Okay, I'm gonna just go ahead and do my first knit stitch here. Okay, that's pretty loose. You want to snug it up pretty tight. What you're also doing when you're doing that is you're also snugging up the stitch on the back. So keep that in mind. You don't want to tug so tight that when you come back around, you can't get your needle back in through the stitches from the cable. So just, you want a nice firm tension on this, but you don't have to have like a death grip on it. Okay, and then I'm going to knit a second stitch, snug it up a little bit. And now we'll just do our purls. Knit 2, purl 2 across. Okay, I have my final 2 purl stitches on what was on needle 1. So I've worked the first 32 stitches of my ribbing. I'm at the end, and now you turn your work over like you were knitting flat. So you turn your work, but instead of working back on those stitches that you just worked, instead you're gonna keep working around for the second set of 32 stitches. Now, these stitches are still on the cable, so we need to push this needle back onto the stitches. Like so, so that they're ready to work. And also, we need to pull the needle out of the stitches we just worked. I'm going to slide that out so that these ones are now sitting on the cable waiting while we knit the second set of 32 stitches. And then make sure you move that yarn in between the needles, because we know we're going to knit that stitch, so we want it right behind the knit stitch. And let me show you how far I pull my needles out. So the cable on the working side of my work is larger than the cable length that I have on the side that I'm working from. And the reason for that is because, well, I like to grip the cable out of the way as I start knitting my round. And if you think about it, we're moving from this needle to this other needle. So we just need more space on this side of our work, even though the stitches aren't going onto the cable at this point. You just need more room to move to rather than to move from. Some instructors may recommend doing about halfway. That works too. And I've also heard some instructors say just pull out a little bit of cable. That is a matter of preference, and you will have to play with what feels best for you. For me, what feels best is to have more space on my working hand, more cable space. Okay, so we know we have our yarn in between. We have our cable and our needle pulled out. So we are ready to start the second half of the ribbing round. Okay, so there is stitch number 1. I'm just going to give it a little snug little pull. There's the back of the stitch. You can see I'm pulling it fairly snugly. It looks tighter than it probably is just because of the way I'm holding the yarn to show you, but yeah, just snug it up a little bit. You will probably have a little bit of a ridge. Either it may be like along the side of your sock on each side, might be a little tight or a little loose, but as you start wearing the socks, they're just going to stretch right into place, and that line won't be so obvious anymore. Similar to if you're used to knitting on double pointed needles, and you know, it's the tension between the stitches on each needle. So in this case, for Magic Loop, you would have two tensioning spots, 2 lines of tensioning. But, you know, you could block your socks. I don't typically bother, but you could block your socks, or you could just start wearing them and it'll just, the yarn's just going to stretch right into place. Okay, and I just finished my 64th stitch, and I know that because my tail is right here, so I know that this is going to be my first stitch and this is my last stitch because my tail is right here. Okay, so now we turn our work over. Let me just zoom out so you can see me doing that. Okay, we're just pretend like it's flat for a sec, like you're knitting flat for a second, and turn your work over just like that. And then you're gonna push your needle right back through. This seems like maybe it's a little time consuming compared to double pointed needles, but like anything, with practice, you get better and faster. So, you know, you, you could definitely continue using double pointed needles, but I do want to just warn you that this pattern is specifically written for magic loop. So you will see in the instructions on needle 1, do this set of instructions, on needle 2, do these sets of instructions. So you'd have to just do a little bit of modification to make it work on double pointed needles. Okay, I want to show you what can happen if you don't move your yarn to the correct positioning for the first stitch in your round. Okay, so this is what not to do. I have my yarn held back here and I'm saying, okay, it's time. I know that I'm still working my 2x2 ribbing. So here we go, 1, 2, purl, 2, knit, 2, purl, 2. Okay, I'm not going to go all the way around because I want to show you what will happen. Do you see how, hold on, let me slide my stitches so they don't fall off while I'm showing you. Okay, so pretend that I worked all the way around and I'm to here, to these final stitches on the cable, which at that point they would be on a needle, correct? Okay, you can see, okay, there's my knit to knit, knit, there's my purl stitch, my second purl stitch, and whoa, wait a second, what do we have here? We have an extra loop. And that's what can happen. That's what will happen if you don't have your yarn positioned right behind the the front needle. Okay. And if that happens to you again, it's not the end of the world. You don't have to go back unless you really, really want to, but you can just drop that right off the edge of your needle when you get to it. So you would knit 2, purl 2, and with this extra loop, just let it fall off of your needle and move on, and make sure that you start this next round correctly with the yarn in the correct position. And it will be fine because it's just going to stretch right into the sock. And as your sock settles, all those stitches kind of settle in, it won't even be noticeable. Okay, so that is the down low on Magic Loop, and it's probably going to take a few goes to figure out the tensioning of the stitches between the needles, and just to kind of get the feel of what it feels like to be sliding the needles with each half of the round. And then of course turning your work, because it almost feels like you're working flat, but you're still working on the front the front of your work. You're still going around and around and around. Okay, so I'm going to link another resource for you that will go in depth with Magic Loop. So if you need additional help, check out that tutorial. I'm going to link that to you. It's on YouTube. And if you need more help than that, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help you. I'm happy to jump on a video call so I can help you see your hands, or have you see my hands. Because I want you to be successful, because I think once you get the technique of this down, you may just absolutely fall in love with it and never go back to double pointed needles. So yeah, please reach out if you have any questions. And now I'm going to go show you how to cast on Magic Loop. If it's easier for you to cast on double pointed needles and then slide them over to the long cabled needles that you have for your sock, go do that. That's fine. If that's more comfortable for you, that's totally fine. Do what will help you feel and be most successful. Okay, let's go cast on. Okay, I went ahead and I took I took the little loop out and backed myself up. And I just wanted to mention one last tip. If you find when, let's see, I'll put this, let's pretend we just finished our second set of 32 stitches and we're turning our work. And it's time to stuff your needle back into your stitches. And when you, I'm going to zoom in on this, when you get to, you're like trying to put your stitches in and you're getting stuck right here at the last stitch or two, and you're like, I really gotta stretch that in there, then that's a good sign that you are tightening that last stitch a little too tight. And next time when you come to the end, try not tugging that stitch quite so tight, because you got to think about how your stitches are sitting on your cable, which is narrower than your needles are. Now, when we're working on 2.25 millimeter needles, there isn't a huge difference between the cable width circumference and the needle circumference, but there is still a significant difference, and you have to be able to slide those stitches back up over the join and onto the actual needle. This is far more critical when you're working on larger needles, but it still can happen. And if you're struggling to get those needles to slide back on your needle, then that's a good sign that you need to maybe ease up a little bit when you're starting your next, when you move between your two needles the next time you come around. Okay, so remember, I was checking to make sure my yarn was in the right place. Give it a gentle tug, but don't snug it up so tight that you are changing the tension of your actual knitting. This takes a little bit of practice, and I'm certain you won't have any problem once you've done, maybe a few rounds. Play with what's tight enough, what's too tight, maybe even practice on purpose to see how, what your preference is and how it feels when you're knitting. Because soon it'll just be second nature to you, and you won't even really think about it anymore. You just naturally tighten up that first stitch a little bit and then move on with the pattern. If you found this helpful, you may enjoy my Step-by-Step Alsie Socks class. Find that at bit.ly/step-by-step socks. Take 30% off by using code 30OFF. Thanks for watching.